you, Barb. I would like to welcome everyone to the August 9th, 2021 meeting of the Operations Work Group. I'm calling the meeting to order. Our first item of business is public input. We received one written statement, and that written statement was in favor of offering families a virtual option for the 2021-22 school year, and this was specifically in reference to elementary school students. That was the only written comment received, and a copy of the full statement is available in board documents. And Barb, did we have any speakers tonight?
No, we do not.
All right. If we have no speakers, we shall move on to item 3, which is approval of minutes. I move to approve the minutes from the Operations Work Group meeting dated March 8th, 2021.
Second.
Second, Nikki Vandermeer.
Any discussion? All right, all those in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0, or 6-0. Oh, Sabian's here, yes, 7-0.
Thank you.
And we shall now move on to the program tonight. All right, so we have 3 agenda items tonight, and there is a common theme running through all of these agenda items, and that is taking the long view of district operations. Our first item is a state budget item, or a state budget update, and there is no action this month related to the state budget, but this will inform our discussions about the final 2021-22 budget, which we will be voting on at the end of October, I believe. And just as important, this is what we're going to hear tonight is going to inform decisions and conversations about the 2022-23 budget. Our second agenda item is the contract amendment and extension for MMSD pupil transportation. Again, no action is required on this item this month. In fact, the board already voted to approve this amendment and extension. Tonight's update is an opportunity to answer questions and get a clearer picture of how this decision will impact student transportation through 2023. And our final agenda item is proposed changes to the board's communicable disease policy and inactivation of 3 COVID-related policies that were previously mandated by Public Health Madison, Dane County. We are currently scheduled to vote on the revised communicable disease policy at the August regular meeting. All right. With that setting the stage, Dr. Jenkins, would you like to make any opening remarks?
I think you pretty much set the context for what we're trying to do, taking that long view. We look forward to the discussion. I think Ross and our finance department has done a fabulous job in terms of outlining what are the impacts where we are right now with the current budget, but also in the future. And so I ask that we pay close attention to that as we are trying to take that long view. With transportation, we've had those preliminary discussions, as you said. I also think that that's still necessary that we have that discussion and just get some of those little things out that we need here. And then I think the rest of it should be pretty simple, but however, let's get all the questions out tonight.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Appreciate your remarks. Let's move on to the budget discussion. This will be a presentation with no breaks. It's not very long, and please hold your questions, comments until the end of the presentation. And Ross, take it away. And thank you so much, Ross.
Thank you very much. All right, good evening. So we're here tonight for an update on the state budget for 21-23. And I'll let Barb get the first slide up there real quick if we could. I wanted to start by indicating where we are in the budget timeline. So on the second tab there, our second slide, we're past the June preliminary approval, and we're now at a point where we're solidifying all of our staffing plans and beginning our budget balancing and reconciliation efforts. Over the next several weeks, we'll be keeping an eye on enrollment patterns and getting ready for our last pieces of information so we can finalize the 21-22 budget. The governor signed the state budget on July 8th. We've been unpacking all the impacts and changes we need to factor in for our fall budget presentation. And I have a few slides that follow that show the most important impacts for Madison. Next slide, please. In short, there's unfortunately not a lot of positive news for K-12 funding in this year's budget. First, we have confirmation that we will receive no inflationary adjustment for the revenue limit per pupil in 2021-22 or 22-23. For this fall, we are expecting 2 one-time or non-recurring exemptions under the revenue limit. The first is called hold harmless. This exemption is triggered in the revenue limit when a multiplication of our 3-year rolling average and revenue limit per pupil results in a figure lower than last year's revenue limit calculation. This exemption is given on a 1-year basis to avoid sudden impacts to recurring revenue limit authority. The second exemption is for declining enrollment, which is just like it sounds. Our enrollment impact during last fall continued to show a downward trend in our 3-year rolling average. These exemptions are also for 1 year to avoid a sudden impact to recurring authority. Both exemptions are removed for next year's calculation to establish a new base amount. There were 2 other items proposed in the state budget that are not in the final document. One proposed that we would be able to count full day 4K students as 1.0 students for membership calculations that would be used for revenue limit and general aid. The other proposed using the higher of 2019 or 2020 fall enrollment data to set revenue limits and general aid amounts. Unfortunately, neither proposal was carried into the Biennium budget, so all 4K students will continue to be counted at 60% or 0.6 of a full-time student, regardless of their enrollment in a half-day or full-day program, and no other considerations were made for pandemic-level impacts on enrollment numbers. General aids were implemented at the lowest proposed amount in the state budget, which was approximately 33% below the governor's budget proposal. There was also no adjustment to the special adjustment aid threshold. It was proposed to increase to 90% for this year, but will remain at 85%. For clarification, when we talk about maximum aid loss or negative 15% in our budget proposals, this is the threshold we're referring to. So instead of staying 85%, they propose it going to 90, but unfortunately it's staying at 85. With these amounts in the state budget and estimated year-end shared cost for Madison, we could be facing as much as a 10% drop in general aid by the time our October 15th certifications come in. This will be heavily dependent on all Wisconsin school district final data as always, but there's also no student count exemption or changes to shared cost calculations that were triggered by these pandemic level impacts on our operations. Also, during his signing ceremony, Governor Evers indicated he was appropriating about $100 million in supplemental aid to Wisconsin school districts. The DPI has not formally indicated how this will be distributed, but according to some news releases, we might see some type of per pupil allocation across the entire state. Next slide, please. Some other funding outcomes from the Biennium budget include special education categorical aid. This ended up being approved at 28.2% and 30% for 22 and 23. Like previous years, this percentage is approved in the state budget as a some certain amount, not some sufficient. This means that the percentages shown here are an estimate based on the certain amount of funding the state's designated. Typically, this percentage will fall by the time we get our final amount from the state in October. If these percentages were some sufficient, then the state would be required to fund that percentage regardless of how much was in the state budget. There will be no increase to bilingual bicultural aid. The proposed budget would have moved this to about 15%, but it will remain at current funding levels, which is approximately 8%. Some investments are being made for student mental health categorical aid programs in the 21-23 state budget. For the most part, these are not competitive grant programs, but instead they're based on submitted costs that we supply for mental health and support staff across our district. There will be very minimal changes to open enrollment, independent charter schools and voucher payments per pupil for the next 2 years. This will impact our fall approval work and will assist in our balancing work over the next several months and also with planning for the 23 budget. Finally, Common School Fund programs, which is specifically for library programming and materials, is expected to increase about 15%. The impact for Madison will be clear in January once we get our certification amounts using state census data. The next slide, please. Locally, we have 2 revenue sources over the next 2 years that were secured in the 2020 operating referendum that will help us. We'll be adding $8 million this fall in our 22 budget and another $9 million next fall for the 23 budget. Thank you again to the Madison community for their dedication to their public schools. Despite these state budget challenges, there is no immediate budget gap expected this fall for the 21-22 budget. However, we do have some warning signals in our revenue limit calculation that will guide our budget work for 2023. I already mentioned that there are 2 non-recurring exemptions coming this fall. This will sustain the budget we already presented and prepared in June of this year, but next year these exemptions will expire, leaving a budgetary hole of approximately $5.25 million in our revenue limit calculation. Declining enrollment and 0 for the next 2 years in the state budget on the revenue limit per pupil is going to make it extremely difficult to fund priorities and maintain services using recurring dollars. Non-recurring exemptions will ultimately net against operating referendum authority to determine final revenue limit calculations for future years. Next slide, please. I also want to take some time to identify that while some of these outcomes will be challenging, others we have dealt with before. Madison has been experiencing declining enrollment for the past 5 budget cycles. Each year, we look at 2 different 3-year enrollment averages that drive our revenue limit calculation. For this upcoming year, we'll be comparing the 18-19, 19-20, and 2021 average to the 19-20, 2021, and 21-22 school years. It's the change in these averages that determine our declining enrollment exemption each year. 2021 was the most severe drop in Madison's recent history. Our resident FTE count dropped approximately 4%. This 1-year drop will generate fluctuations in those 3-year averages until the 23-24 school year, when both 3-year averages we're comparing won't include the large drop from the 19-20 to 2021 school years. This is important because if we have any type of repeat state budget in 23-25 that shows another 0-0 in the per pupil increase, we will continue to trigger these declining enrollment and hold harmless exemptions. This will erode our base revenue limit calculation for future years. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to put some of these numbers into perspective. What you're looking at here are parts of our revenue limit calculations for the past 4 years and our current outlook for fall of this year. At the very top, you can see what our average FTE loss is in the revenue limit calculation each year and what our declining enrollment exemption is each year. As you can see, our hold harmless exemptions are extremely high in 2021 and 2022. Next, you can see that hold harmless has been triggered 3 times in the last 5 years. All 3 times we had a state budget with no increase to the per pupil amount under the revenue limit. That's not a coincidence. Next, I want you to see what we record as recurring and non-recurring exemptions under the revenue limit. The operating referendums MMSD has passed in recent years are recorded here. These amounts are automatically included in our base revenue limit each year, and these recurring exemptions have been one of the only ways we've been able to grow our revenue limit in those recent years. Below the recurring exemptions are our non-recurring exemptions. These are granted on a 1-year basis each year they are generated. At the very top, you'll see our declining enrollment exemption listed again. Why are these important? Well, look at the total for the non-recurring exemptions, especially in the final 2 years. With the exception of voucher, choice pupils, and our energy efficiency exemption, these exemptions are tied to operating costs. This means that we are sustaining our budget each year using one-time safety nets in the revenue limit calculation. And Barb, if you could click once, please, there's an arrow on this slide. There we go. For the current year, we're generating over an estimated $10 million in non-recurring exemptions. Next year, we'll probably generate another smaller declining enrollment exemption, but we'll first have to subtract prior year non-recurring exemptions before we start. And one more time, please, Barb. And again, thank you. I've highlighted here what will occur between the final revenue limit in 2021 and the base revenue limit for 21-22. You'll notice that from 2021 to 21-22, the only increase in our revenue limit came from our recurring exemptions, which are circled in the middle, that $6,215,000. In general, non-recurring exemptions reduce our ability to control the tax levy locally because we're unable to build a base level of funding under declining enrollment and no inflationary increase from the state. These exemptions force us to move backwards. Anytime a Wisconsin school district under levies, no carryover revenue limit authority can be generated until the total of all non-recurring exemptions is exceeded. This means if we don't max out our revenue limit each year, we lose these funds forever. Since we did not have an approved state budget in time for our spring budget work, many of these non-recurring exemptions are tied up in operating costs for this fall. This will guide how we frame our beginning budget work for 22-23 and beyond. And last slide, please. I realize there was a lot of technical in there, but Thank you for letting me go on a little bit tonight. I realize there's not a lot of good news here, but we've worked through challenges like this in the past, and we'll continue to communicate with you as our budget outlook changes. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ross. Really appreciate this presentation, very concise and detailed and informative. Before we go into questions, clarifications, I wanted to make a couple points. The first one is that Madison is not alone in facing these kind of budget issues. This is a statewide budget, and declining enrollment due to COVID is a statewide phenomenon, and therefore districts across the state, I'm sure, are grappling both with the zero per pupil revenue adjustment combined with the reliance on these safety nets for declining enrollment and hold harmless. And second, Madison is, well, not in a great position. We are better positioned because of the generosity of our taxpayers who approved the operating referendum. Without that operating referendum, this year's budget would be hard, and next year's budget would be devastatingly hard. Because we have those extra dollars, while it's still going to be difficult, it will help us ensure that we're able to meet the needs of our children if we're thoughtful and careful. So once again, I want to express deep gratitude to the people of Madison, the voters of Madison, who approved this extra levy authority for our schools and our children. With that said, let's open it up for questions. Barb, would you be willing to take down the PowerPoint just so I can see people? Thanks. All right, just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got any questions. Ollie.
Ross, thank you so much for that presentation. I guess, you know, that the forecast seems pretty disappointing when you consider kind of what we're getting out of the state budget, and I'm wondering what we anticipate the solution to those long-term shortfalls will be.
Well, in the short term, like I said, we don't have a lot that we need to do, and we've tied up a lot of our existing resources in the stuff we've presented in over this past spring. Looking forward, though, by the time we get preliminary information about what exemptions we're looking at next year, I anticipate we're not going to rebound our declining enrollment position anytime soon. But any students that come back to MMSD will help us rebuild that base, so that these non-recurring exemptions I referred to will stop being these one-time holes that are generated in future budget years. But we're going to have to really look at our existing programs and priorities and find out how we can best move forward.
Thank you so much, Ross.
Amanda.
Thank you so much, Board Member Caruzzi, and thank you for framing this conversation complicated and normalized for the state of Wisconsin, and also sharing your appreciation with our community on the voting of the referendum. Thank you so much, Ross, for the presentation. I really appreciate the concisiveness and sharpness that you have provided us. I have a follow-up to Ali's questions in regards to, are you saying that one of the strategies, well, the way I'm interpreting is that one of the strategies is to not just maintain our enrollment, but really focusing on increasing enrollment as a budgetary strategy. Is that correct?
Correct. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna, please provide any further information on that, but I would also be interested in hearing, like, what is the percentage that we can be building upon over the next few years that you find to be a financial, in order to get us financially sustainable?
Well, like I said in the presentation, it's going to take us a couple of years to potentially erase the impact of the declining enrollment from last fall. Unfortunately, we didn't get some of the things we asked for, to at least use a different enrollment count or a sustained enrollment count, so that we weren't going to be losing money over the next several years. But it is true that our base building for the next 3 years, at least where we still have referendum authority, is going to be solely based on the referendum approval. We really won't have any money coming in the revenue limit at all. And in fact, we're going to continue to generate these one-year exemptions against that revenue limit authority, and it's going to end up somewhere in the middle, right? We're saying we approved $8 million this year, 9 next year, and 10 in the final year. But those amounts are going to be net against these exemptions each year, and it's going to start to whittle away the authority we asked for. So as far as a base building, we're still looking at less than 2% growth each year, and that's being somewhat modest.
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you say what? Oh, sorry. And then maybe you framed this as a so if you were framing what you said in a positive, what would be a goal for increasing enrollment?
Well, in order to reverse the impacts of last year, we would need to surpass the loss by last year and then some, because that 3-year average is going to incorporate those 2 off years until 23-24.
Right.
So we would need not only a rebound, but a surge of enrollment to completely counteract that. That being said, with everything else factored into what we have, the growth in revenue authority is going to be contingent solely on that referendum approval. That's all.
Okay. And so I can look it up. You may not have the number right now. So, but we can look it up and see what's the percentage of enrollment we lost over the past 2 years, and then add a cushion in that in order for us to calculate what would be something sustainable. Is that what you're walking us through?
Pretty much. So we lost 4% this year, but in the enrollment projections we had discussed last November, we only projected getting back about 78 students going into this fall. And that was after a loss of over 800 resident students. So we're not exactly rebounding as much as we want to.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ross. And I'll conclude my thoughts on just, saying we have amazing initiatives that are new to us in Madison with the virtual academy, with the 4K, all day 4K, the new school, and the renewed leadership that I'm hoping that will inspire our staff and will inspire our community to really take a look again and potentially communities outside of Madison to join our Madison community and enroll their kids to Madison School. So thank you so much, Ross, and thank you, Board Member Carusi.
Yep, this is more a statement than a question. Basically, we have major financial issues and we have probably very few ways to deal with it. One, we have multiple schools on the north side, and don't kill me, north side people. But we have multiple schools that are only at 50% capacity that we're going to have to look at either combining the schools or cutting the costs on that. And that's the first thing. The second thing that we need to do, and I agree with Ananda on this 100%, is we need to use our initiatives. I think the full day 4K is going to attract more people than we think, because a lot of people couldn't afford to take their kids to part day 4K because they couldn't afford the double dip where they'd have to pay again to keep their kids in daycare because both parents worked. So I think that will be a major input. And we cut what we can and we do the best we can for our community. We're a pretty strong community, but we can't give up hope that this is possible, but we can look into certain strategies, multi-year classrooms, and we can also look into closing certain schools or limiting and combining certain schools. That's the way I see it, but that's my view.
Thank you, Ross, for your level-headed presentation of the issue and your reminder that we have been through similar scenarios before. I just want to ground this conversation in goal 3, that all Black children and youth will excel in schools, and want to remind some of us that some of our Blackest schools in the city reside on the north side, and we should not consider removing resources for those kids in those schools. I think we have a variety of options to meet our financial responsibilities and obligations to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars and center the needs of children in our budget and their academic, social, and emotional needs. And so we should just continue to monitor the situation and urge state leaders to also center the needs of kids in all their decision making.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Ross, for this presentation. Very clear and very, I guess like others, disappointing just to see how it all balances out. I guess when I thought of us approving these referenda, and very thankful to the community for approving these operating funds, didn't have a vision that it would be canceled out along the way, or at least partially, that we wouldn't be able to invest in new initiatives and invest in our staff, you know, the ways that we had planned and that we have done in the past. And so I guess my question is sort of, maybe this is more theoretical, but what would it take for the exemptions to not cancel out the operating referendum that we already, you know, that we have coming forward thanks to our community?
Right. So we can go through a more detailed example at another time that we can show how they net each other. It's not that it's going to completely cancel out the referendum. It's that these non-recurring exemptions, and when they're generated, instead of going into our base each year. So if we get $100 per pupil and we multiply that by 27,000 kids, that dollar amount gets added to our base revenue each year, and that stays with us as a growing district, if not on enrollment, then on that per pupil amount. Since we have both factors working the opposite, these one-time exemptions get generated and they signal that these costs need to either be reduced somewhere in the organization, in the budget, or needs to be phased out, because over time, these exemptions will continue to shrink that base revenue. So instead of growing it, it's actually an organic way to shrink it. So these exemptions will come back every year in some fashion. And like those averages move, it's going to continue to shrink in amplitude, but the difference between each year, that's going to erode the base and count against the referendum. So if we have a $3 million declining enrollment exemption one year and a $2.5 million declining enrollment exemption the next year, that net loss is about $500,000. So that will erode against the authority we asked for in the referendum. Not the full amount, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate that. And maybe cancel out was not the right word to use as I was asking that question, but I think we are going to have to take a look at where we are investing, and if the base is shrinking, where we are going to either streamline or how we're going to manage that going forward in the future. So I guess I'll look forward to hearing how process-wise we're going to manage that discussion.
For sure.
Thanks for the presentation. Appreciate it.
Maya, did you have any questions or comments? Hearing none, I've got a couple. Ross, my first question is, do you have any sense about limitations or rules about what the governor's supplemental aid can be used for?
To my understanding, in the signing ceremony, he stated there would be no restrictions, but as it is federally sourced, I'm not sure if there's going to be a grant program created at DPI that would still require us to use all the same rules and regulations, or if it's just going to be coming through as some type of as one-time aid. Again, the DPI has not given us clear information, just that the money is coming. I know that there was a release to the paper that indicated that this may be a per pupil allocation, but again, without DPI clarifying what that looks like, I can't say for sure what it looks like.
Do you anticipate we'll have more flexibility with this pot of money than we will with ESSER?
Absolutely. I mean, he even said as much in the statement. Yep. In the signing ceremony, sorry.
My second question, and I don't know if you have an answer to this one, but I'm just curious. We've pretty much committed the money that we have this year. I'm wondering if there's anything we can do in the 2021-22 budget to soften the blow a little bit in 22-23.
There are some. I'm sorry.
Oh, given the commitments we've already made and that we're pretty much locked into most of them.
So as you can imagine, a lot of our commitments are set for the year. That being said, I know that we're still hiring staff, and there are certain things that have not started yet, but there are many parts of the budget that are already underway. So it'd be difficult to soften the blow to the amounts we've been discussing tonight, but we could have discussions throughout the fall and the spring about anything we'd want to pause on to see if we need to make adjustments before fall approval.
And is there, I suspect we won't really know what the governor's money can be used for until we're pretty close to the time when we have to pass our final budget.
Right. I'd be surprised if we didn't hear something about it soon. The release I put in the board packet tonight that outlined all the changes in the budget, the state budget, came out the day before I sent it. So I think they're currently putting all those pieces together, and I would expect to hear something from the DPI in the next few weeks at most.
Yeah, I look forward to having a conversation about, in particular, how that pot of money might be able to help us with our operations budget in terms of buildings. I think, we don't want to get ourselves in the position where we're moving recurring money onto one-time money, because eventually that one-time money will go away, and then we'll end up not having any money to do our building work. But at the same time, we know that the amount of work we need to do on our buildings every year exceeds the budget we have available. And, we had talked originally about the referendum potentially being a source of funds for some building work at the elementary level, which hasn't, or possibly middle school level, which hasn't been done for a while. And I'm just kind of wondering if Governor Evers' money could be used in lieu of referendum money to do some of those projects. Is that one strategy we could look at?
Okay. I'll take a note of that. And when we do get guidelines, I'll make sure that we have a discussion then about what it can and cannot be used for.
That would be really helpful. Thank you. Anything else? All right. Ross, thank you so much for this great presentation one more time. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody on the board for your good comments and questions.
Thank you.
I look forward to moving forward with this group. We can handle these difficult decisions, and I know we'll move forward with wisdom. So, yes, Dr. Jenkins.
Maya,
Oh, Maya, I'm sorry. Did you have a question, Maya?
No, I don't have any other questions. I think everyone has kind of said the sentiment that I share, just about how do we try to make up any shortfalls that may happen in the future. But thank you, Ross, for your presentation. It was very helpful.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we will close out this part of the discussion and move on. Our next agenda item is the contract and amendment and extension for MMSD pupil transportation. Once again, we'll get an update followed by time for questions and clarifications. And I'd like to invite Cedric Hodo and Nick Cowan to present.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, board members. Can you hear me good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, board, for the opportunity to present to you again this evening, just to kind of share a little insight in regards toward the contract here. Myself and Mick will kind of walk this through and kind of open ourselves up for questions right afterwards. But just to kind of give you a brief overview from the project perspective of it. Recently, of course, you all voted to push the new contract through. Historically, the RFP during the fall of last year, the proposals typically go out sometime around February. What we're looking for now is an additional year on to the contract in and of itself. We put some analysis and rationale that we'll go into a little bit deeper, but I wanted Mick just to give a brief overview right fast, and then we'll begin to get into the specific question around it. Hey, Mick, you want to take us off?
Yes, thank you, Cedric. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And, as we discussed during the board meeting, we had some underlying rationale, I guess, around why we were looking for an extension, another year of extension. And it really had to do with getting feedback that our current RFP timeline for transportation was just too short. It didn't really allow for the best participation from potential carriers. And in that, if we were to extend that timeline a little bit, or quite a bit, we would allow them more opportunity to really prepare a good proposal. But even more so on the backside of that, once it was approved and the board were to decide who was awarded the contract, it would allow that contractor more time to really get up and running. Because if it's a new carrier, we're talking about property, we're talking about acquiring buses and getting properly staffed. Our current and past, I should say our past timeline has been relatively short. You know, we're releasing November, we're getting responses in February. By the time we got through the process, it's already April or May, and we're talking about getting up and running for that upcoming school year. So it was very short. With that in mind, we had to really look at if we wanted to provide that extra timeline, we would have to release the RFP essentially in July, already this past month, and get that out to allow for a much longer timeline. In doing that, we would have had to have used 2019-20 partial school year data to really develop that that kind of day in the life of transportation, so that the carriers would have an opportunity to submit cost proposals. So that data it'd be somewhat old. We could make an assumption that we're going to move into the school year coming up beyond this one similar to that, but it really didn't allow us an opportunity to really account for any type of changes we might experience going into this year. So that was one of the underlying issues that we were looking at. Of course, the other underlying issues are just the unknowns, as I mentioned. You know, what are we going to experience coming up? So if we're releasing an RFP now and allowing that timeline to be more closer to a year, we may not be factoring in some things that we're going to experience this upcoming year. So that what we're looking at is, you know, what's the possibility of getting that extension and really getting ourselves removed from the pandemic, hopefully a little bit more, and more close to what our new norm or what we might be experiencing, what we might have coming up. So, and then there was also some uncertainties as to, you know, when carriers across the country are struggling and they can't hire drivers, they're struggling. You know, are they really going to participate in a large RFP like this? And if so, you know, what is that participation going to look like? Is it going to be a lot of risk mitigation and higher cost proposals? We just don't know. It's more about less about what we knew and more about what we don't know. So that's kind of the underlying issues that we were trying to accomplish by getting yet another year's of extension and getting that done. And then, of course, there's always the risk of, you know, a carrier being well-intended and submitting a proposal, and then we getting closer to implementation, and they're not able to get up and running to the extent that they thought they could. And our current provider has existing property, has existing equipment, have existing staff, and have a very good understanding of what our expectations are. So I think, Cedric, I may have covered everything. Certainly let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. And two more quick points right fast. So just to give you an example to the board, I've worked on the other side of the contractors, and I kind of know the blueprint. I help write most of them. In a situation like this here, you're looking at cost. This is strictly a cost decision for us. Myself and Mick, I want to be perfectly clear. We are not either pro nor against our current busing contractor. But this is strictly a cost analysis. So in situations like this here, typically a new vendor, when that company comes in, the costs are associated to that. Let's just say, let's take a bus. One bus typically costs roughly around $85,000. Just to get 50 buses, about $4.2 million. A lot of these costs are amortized back to the school district over the length of the contract. That's one issue. You got to also talk about housing of these buses, heating, putting all the bells and whistles on them. There's a lot of underhanded costs associated in a situation like this here. If you give the vendors ample time to do their research, it all hinges on the data that's there provided. Currently, right now, we only have 2019 and 2020's data. COVID 2 years running, roughly 19, 20, 2021, we don't know where we're going to end up at. And so certainly right now for the board members, if you want to take this out to the RFP right now, myself and Mick are ready to pull that switch. I want to make sure we clear on that. The downside to that is the timeline necessary for vendors to get in and adequately bid this is a daunting task. It is absolutely daunting. And what happened is costs will be hidden inside legal language. The impact of myself and legal to try to redline every single detail to figure out where these hidden costs are. Contractors are very good. And I think that we will ultimately see a spike or a spiral in our busing contract. Right now, going year to year, we looked at approximately 700,000 increase. Should we take this out to bid strictly from a cost perspective, you should expect that easily to exceed well over $1 million, $1.5 million in initial costs just to get the vendor here. You're talking staffing, personnel, et cetera. So I just want to make sure I share those points, and we're open up for any discussion that the board may have. I want to thank you for this opportunity. We know that this is a very complex situation. We've also provided talking points and rationale and data in the analysis of itself, and definitely we open for discussion, anything you might have. I'll close.
All right, well, thank you so much for that update, and I invite the board to ask questions or provide comments or discussion. I can start things off. Mick, one of the things that was apparent in the memo you provided us was that the transition of our middle school students onto yellow buses to facilitate later middle school start times was one of many reasons to extend this contract rather than reaching out for a new contract. And I wondered if you could give us just a little bit of an update as to whether or not COVID has altered that timeline for moving our middle school students to later start times, and where we're at with that process.
Certainly, it was I would say it was a minor benefit to the extension. I'll start by saying, yes, COVID did, there was a decision made to pause the transition last year, given everything that was going on. So there was a pause year. So we are just now entering the second year of a 3-year implementation. So the second year of that for this upcoming school year. And so I mentioned in the memo that allowing this extension would allow us to go not only through the second year, but also through the third and final year with the same carrier who worked diligently with us to come up with that implementation plan. So could it be done with another carrier? It certainly could, but there would be a learning curve for them to get up and running and understanding it. And so I would look at that as I don't want to say minor, because I think it's significant, but I don't think it was at the top of our list of rationale points. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Fabian,
Thank you.
I saw your hand. Yeah, go ahead, Fabian.
Thank you for the update on this matter. In your view, what, this is a constant conversation, but what avenues of recourse do we have to, demand better customer support from our current provider? It's no secret that we've had some frustrations with this particular provider.
Yeah, I would agree with you. As of late, we did have a couple of incidents, and certainly no excuse for them, and I could not suggest that they weren't extreme and highly disappointing. I would go back and say that we've had a long track record with this provider, and I don't think it would be fair to suggest that incident, as horrible as I'll say it was, is indicative of or defines their entire length of service for us. What we have is a very strong contract with very strong language and the ability to specifically address incidents as they happen and ensure we do everything we can within our power to ensure that they never happen again. And I think as long as we gain a clear and good understanding of what happened, what mechanisms we had in place, and what is it about our mechanisms that didn't get us to the end result that we should have gotten to. So I do think we have a strong contract. I think we have good, strong language. I think we do have a committed ownership team there that will respond in the way that they should. I think where we get a little bit sidetracked is when we start to talk in general terms. It's more difficult for us to address those. So as we're having an issue, and it doesn't always have to rise to the level of the issue that we had recently, but as we're having issues, we're addressing them as they happen. And we're going at it in a detailed, very well-informed manner. And I think we have a track record of doing that here, and we can continue to do that, and we can improve that with clear communication coming to us so that we can address those issues thoroughly.
Got it. Thank you for that answer, and just in general interested in ensuring that for the services that we receive excellent customer service. And yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand and agree that we need an extension here, but also interested in that, we enforce our contract on the books.
Absolutely, Savion, if I can add to something, one of the things that we're doing this year to underscore your on what you just stated is we have not provided data-driven metrics to determine if they're doing good or not. Number of riders, frequency of stops, are they dropping off on time, et cetera. Myself and Mick is working on weekly and even monthly reports by which we can provide the board on the numerous things that they have done. Oftentimes you may hear the negative options, but 10,000 kids being dropped off on a daily basis and all of them make it safe. Nobody ever hears about that. Of course, they get paid for that. But at the end of the day, we want to put some metrics around that and hopefully provide you on a monthly basis that progress. So this is something we've had hard conversations. Rest assured, there have been some very brutal conversations we've had with our contractor. But we are doing the best that we can right now to drill down on those specific concerns and address them as they come. Technology ultimately will solve this problem. There's multiple technology streams that can be looked into at a later basis. But when the new RFP go out, is our plan to put some of these metrics inside the new RFP.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments before we move on? Chris?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for this presentation. A lot of what you're presenting makes a whole lot of sense given the middle school start times transition and just the flux that we're in with our enrollment and being able to predict how that is going to work out. One of my questions is, you sort of mentioned it as you were doing your presentation, but the challenge of finding staffing for the bus companies. Can you explain a little bit more about that? And is this carrier that we're extending the contract with in a good place to be able to provide the services and the transportation at the level we need this school year and into the next?
Yeah, Mick, you want to take?
Yeah, I will do my best at this. I want to echo something Cedric just said. I don't think either one of us are pro or con with our current carrier. We want to be wise stewards of taxpayer dollars and make the best decision for the district. So when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not saying this to be defensive for the carrier. The reality is carriers across the country and all around us are struggling. They're struggling to find drivers and get drivers, people who are willing to work. The people who are applying, there's a high standard, and rightfully so. Many of our schools would like to see bus drivers be as equally educated and experienced as teachers in classrooms, to be honest. But there's a struggle to get staff who will apply, and then based on that, who really are qualified and can get past the background checks that should be what they are. Is our carrier better off or worse off? I don't believe they're worse off. We are hearing of other districts who are struggling with more driver shortage than we are, but we certainly do have the challenge of a driver shortage right now, and that's been all over the news. We're doing as much as we can here with our team to reduce that by looking at every element we can go through to maybe combine routes. And we're doing that. We're combining routes. You might use the word aggressively. We're trying to reduce the number of drivers we are short, and we're working on that. Long hours working on that. We're trying to do the best that we can. I just gave you a long answer. The reality is they are struggling. They are short. I don't think they're any shorter than anybody else. Everybody's looking. You can kind of do a search and see that they're also increasing their hiring bonus to $5,000. There's another school district that I see in Minnesota doing the same thing, who also reported that it didn't work, but we're being optimistic. We want to be optimistic. We want to keep trying to do the best that we can and have some discussions as to how we're going to react to that as we get closer.
And Christina, just to add a couple more points I thought was critical for us. We did not sit back and wait on this. This is like a train coming down the track and we're laying on the track. We were very proactive to the extent of job fairs, an aggressive campaign. They've placed buses strategically throughout the city with marketing information. We put together $5,000 bonuses. We even had to pull Dr. Jenkins aside and really ask him, will he help us? And again, his whole focus is get the kids to school. Having no transportation is not an option. And so we know that we're doing every doomsday scenario that we can. We started off with 85 drivers to run this operation successfully. We're down to 45, 46 drivers to pull it off with probably a spare of 7 to 8 drivers. And so that put compression on our routes right now. And so we're trying to do our best between doubling and potentially tripling routes. It's a bit of a disruptor. COVID has been a huge disruptor to us. We're doing all that we can. We're working with the chiefs directly, as well as with our superintendent, to hopefully find the bottom line solution within the next couple of days. But based upon what we see, we still envision a shortage. And despite our best efforts, we have not been able to move that needle. We're even at a point where we're ready to go out and ask for principals. Can we reach out to your social networks, your student advisory committees, et cetera, PTAs, and see if anybody would volunteer to assist the busing contract and help us in this arena. So this is a very tough time, unprecedented times. But rest assured, we're working to do our best to get these positions filled.
Thank you so much for that response, and I have every confidence that, you are working hard on this, and I really appreciate all the work that's going into it. To me, it just points to another reason to not take the risk of switching, given that this is a systemic problem, across the city, across, the country. So thank you for all the work on this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Questions? Dr. Jenkins?
Yes, I just want to take this. Uh-oh. Okay, we have it.
Yeah, mute.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
All right, that's better. I just want to take this opportunity too, because sometimes we share the news. Ross did a fabulous job with that, but also this part with Cedric and also Mick. And Mick, I just want to take the opportunity to publicly say thank you. We're looking going forward, but coming from this past year, the work that he did, his entire department, they were putting in 20-hour days sometimes, and people didn't know it. And the work that they're putting into this to make sure that we have the best decision in front of us. And as you heard both of them say, either for or against, but I also went over to Badger, had a chance to maybe talk to them. The conversations that's been taking place, regardless of the decision we make to go out or stay in, and we've already made the decision to go with an extension, I can tell you that Azure, they've been pretty committed, and so I'm glad to hear the question that Savion asked about continuous quality though. With anyone that we have, we want to make sure that we're getting that service of excellence. So thank you, Nick, and thank you, Cedric Hodo, for the work that you have done and your due diligence in this particular issue for our children. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those thanks. This update was really helpful and gave us an opportunity to discuss some of the longer-term issues around transportation of our kids. So thanks for this opportunity and for the great presentation. And let's move on to our policy discussion this evening. So we are noticed to talk about 4 policies. The existing board policy on communicable disease, which is policy 7550, and 3 COVID policies that were previously mandated by Public Health Madison, Dane County, 7549, 51, and 52. Dr. Jenkins and our legal counsel have recommended inactivating the 3 COVID policies as the Public Health Madison, Dane County orders that mandated those policies have been withdrawn. And legal counsel have proposed significant revisions to our communicable disease policy. The soonest we could vote on these changes would be the August regular meeting. So again, we're going to have a presentation followed by time for questions and discussion. And I would like to invite Sherry to present this information to us.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. My internet has been a little jumpy this evening, but hopefully I can get through this before it decides it wants to go out tonight. The memo I provided for you to read in connection with this is essentially my best thinking about where we need to go with the policies that public health mandated that we implement with regard to COVID, the 1920 school year, and how those policies relate to our longstanding communicable disease policy, which is 7550. I think that we need to think about COVID as a communicable disease, just like the other diseases that are recognized by the state as being such. And when we were mandated to implement policy 7549, which was the hygiene policy, policy 7551, which was the protective measures policy, and policy 7552, which is the facility cleaning policy, really, looking at those, to me, they fit within the communicable disease policy, but because we were mandated to implement separate policies, that is what we did to meet the requirements of the current or then orders by the Public Health Department. Moving away from those 3 policies and reverting back to our communicable disease policy certainly allows the superintendent to do what has been done continuously throughout COVID, and that is to adjust and be flexible given the changes in guidance from the federal level, the state level, the CDC, our public health department, because most of the guidance has just been that guidance and not regulation. We would not be able to be nimble if we specifically laid out how we should act with regard to any communicable disease, and not give the flexibility to administration to act in accordance with what we know based on the guidance from those agencies, as well as the guidance from our team of medical experts that we regularly check with, and the metrics team that reviews all of this information as well. And so my proposal was that we inactivate those 3 policies that we were mandated to actually activate, and then revert back to our 7550. In addition, you will note that the district's COVID safety plan is referenced on the homepage at the very top, and COVID has its own page within the district website that lays out the complete and full safety plan that we will be implementing. And it is for that reason that, because those plans may change, just as we've seen changes throughout the summer, that we're not actually putting that information within the actual policy, because that is practice. And policy tells us exactly what the board mandates that needs to be done. And with that, I'll pause for questions and try to answer as best I can.
Thank you, Sherry. I will open up the floor for questions. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sherry, for this explanation of the purpose behind the changes that are being proposed. I guess when I look at this, I understand that when we were creating in January, when we created the 3 policies that we put in place, the hygiene, the facility cleaning, and the protective measures, that was very reactive to the Madison-Dane County, Public Health Madison-Dane County emergency order. We needed to have those. We've had this communicable disease policy that basically was approved in 2003, and it hasn't been updated since then. And so I guess I'm looking at this as to me, it almost seems too general, and I'm sort of trying to figure out if there's a way we can keep some of the pieces of the 3 policies that we have, in addition to updating this communicable disease policy to be more relevant and applicable to COVID in particular. I guess the other question I have is, we put the hygiene policy in place for COVID, but really it's good policy for hygiene in the schools, whether you're talking about COVID or you're talking about, viruses that spread or any other type of thing where you want, students to and staff to have specific guidelines around hygiene. So, yeah, I guess that's my question is balancing the policy aspect with the guideline aspect and how to do the level of detail that we need.
Well, I think certainly even before COVID, all of these areas were covered, right? Mr. Hodo's department, building services, and the custodial team covered the facility cleaning parts of that, right? And they followed any guidelines that were out there with regard to cleaning our facilities and particularly our school buildings for our children. And then with regard to hygiene and the protective measures, certainly, Nurse Smith, Wendy Smith, who is the new Assistant Director of Health Services, her team, and before her, Nurse Sally's team, certainly reviewed all of those and put out guidance in accordance to whatever was going on within the community. You spoke a little bit about being too general, but my thought is that, and we've all heard the experts say, this isn't the end, right? There's going to be something else. And so if we're going to continue to create policies for that one communicable disease, and then the next one comes and we create another policy, I don't know how that helps us, because we will continue to create policies that'll just be pushed to the side when we could be focusing on, how to implement the policies we have with the most fidelity and making sure that we're meeting all of the guidance that's required to keep our students and staff safe.
One of the other questions I have is that the policy, the communicable disease policy, as it was revised, references directly the health services, what's it called? Health services guidelines?
It's the health services guidance, yes.
Guidance. And is that something that we have, that we can see or have access to? Is that a particular, document, or where does that guidance live for schools?
As I indicated, I believe earlier today, that guidance sits with the Health Services Department. And as Wendy Smith is just starting with us, I wanted to give her an opportunity to review that. And as I noted in, I believe, the write-up, as well as in the rewritten policy, that is to first meet our obligation to the state to educate students and staff about bloodborne pathogens. And then it's a general ways of working around communicable diseases and other diseases that may manifest in our area. And it's not necessarily so specific to any one illness or disease. It's more of a way of working when we know that there are illnesses and diseases that can be spread within our environment and how to react to that.
Okay, thank you. I guess my one concern is just pulling back on these very specific policies that cover us during COVID when we know we're still we're in the middle of dealing with COVID as we start the school year. So just trying to figure out how to navigate that with all of you in the most effective way to make sure that schools and parents and staff have the guidance that we need going forward for the upcoming school year is important.
All right, I saw Nikki and then Dr. Jenkins.
Yes, I happen to agree with Chris Gomez-Schmidt on not rescinding those policies, especially at the time of a Delta outbreak the way it is. Goal 1, if you look at it, says we provide a school environment where every child can succeed. You are an individual with disabilities and breathing issues, an individual with disabilities who cannot attend due to lack of masks or other safety issues, then you aren't getting the same quality of education. This specificity is needed in the time of COVID to have that. Not include that, I think, would be a violation of our own policy. Additionally, right now we have, if you look around the nation, our district happens to be relatively nice. We haven't had death threats. We haven't threatened board members. Thank God for that, and thank God for science and common sense. At the same point, I think in the middle of a pandemic that we could hold off 1 year and relook at it just to make sure. I mean, why can't we have both? One that relates to COVID and the other. COVID has its own policy, it's its own disease. It killed 600,000 plus. I think that the severity of the disease is a problem. Additionally, the individuals that I've talked to who have kids with severe cerebral palsy, which I've talked to 3 of them who kids couldn't go back during the pandemic because it wasn't safe, who were virtual and who were doing the best they can. They're thanking me that there are policies in place. And I do worry. I'm not saying that this gets rid of the policies. And I understand Sherry's point, and legally I understand it. But in this case, I really think the source of caution to have more protection rather than less happens to be a successful situation for at least 1 year. I figure that we could revisit it next year when people's lives aren't currently at threat from an illness that could take a lot of people, at least in my community, which is the only one I can speak for.
Thank you, Nikki. Dr. Jenkins and then Ananda.
I'd just like to say thank you, first of all, for the discussion. Chris actually sits on the Wellness Medical Advisory team with us, and so she understands how fluid this is, and we're hearing directly from the doctors each week. I think Nikki's points, I tell you, I totally understand and respect that. I just sit in a position myself for when this first happened. I was the superintendent that made the first call to close schools. I was in the state of Minnesota. It happened here in Wisconsin with Madison, right? Some districts did not have the policies, some did, that delayed the closing of schools. And when the initial COVID hit, it spread like wildfire. But because of the fact that they were being hampered, they didn't have the fluidity to make decisions. Just think how many more were exposed to COVID. This is one of those situations where I'm glad we're having this level of discussion because it's serious. If you look at 7550 as our general counsel's recommended, is to give us that fluidity in case, right now we're dealing with COVID. And if you listen to all the science behind and all the predictions, something else is coming. We don't know what it's going to be honest with you. But we need to be nimble if something happens. And I'll never forget, something happened on a Thursday night, couldn't get anyone at the health department or at the state. So I had to just make a decision, close schools on Friday, the 13th. Same thing happened here in Madison. Even the governor was delayed in making a decision, and then some schools waited 2 weeks later. Now we know more. I think we're trying to be proactive and saying we're going to be ahead of it, working with our medical advisors, working with public health right there. And I do think that the health field now are more in it. With the schools, we're collaborating more now. You see it every week when we meet. It's on Tuesdays. So just having that degree, but I also heard what Nikki said too, the level of specificity around it needs to be there. So it's one of those things I would much rather see us go with the council's proposing and continue to give the regular updates specifically on COVID with the Delta variant coming. Where are we right now? We need to keep this on our agendas.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Ananda?
Yeah, thank you so much, Board Member Caruzzi. Thank you so much, Board Member Vandermeulen, for your remarks. I really appreciate the concern. I share the same concerns. And if you have been paying attention, I feel like I've been pretty consistent to where we are with COVID is where we'll be for a while. And I don't see this from a pessimist perspective. I say this because I'm looking at the historical context of communicable diseases in other countries outside of the US, and also the history of communicable diseases in humankind history. I don't think this is a year. I don't think this is a 2 year. I think we're going to be in this communicable disease landscape for a few years. But if I understand correctly, Sherry, your attempt to streamline our policies is not to say COVID is no longer relevant, or to say that like we are scaling back like our efforts to protect and to keep both our students and our staff and our community safe. It's a merely an attempt to streamline our language that COVID is another communicable disease, and there's this broader policy that is covering all those aspects of what happens when we have this type of disease. It's specifically because we know much more than what we knew when we were patching those policies together, and also understanding that we might be, today's COVID, it might be something else. And please correct me, Sherry, if I'm not interpreting or understanding your points correctly.
No, you are absolutely correct. You said patching, and what came to mind was a patchwork quilt. So what we had to do was patch together a group of policies and then try to make them coherent with policies that we already had. And simply what I'm suggesting is to not have confusion about what the policy is. We have a communicable disease policy that will cover any disease that's considered communicable by the health field. And we have our group of experts that we've come to rely on to give us guidance. And if we're so specific in our policy writing, we will essentially nullify the advice of our group of experts because we won't be able to be nimble and shift. For example, this summer, we went from, everyone has to wear a mask inside and outside to, well, if you've been vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask inside. And now we're going back to, well, even if you've been vaccinated, you need to wear a mask inside, and you should really consider wearing a mask outside. So we need to be able to move our district-wide safety plan in alignment with the guidance that we're given, because I just don't believe that we will be able to rely on the health orders that we were able to rely on in the past, because our governments won't be able to do that. They'll be restricted by the legislature. And so this is our attempt to be able to be nimble and move with the direction of our medical experts.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I appreciate the additional explanation, and I appreciate all my colleagues being in such support to both protect our, being unapologetic about protecting our students and our staff. I think Nikki mentioned before, like it's not the same outside of Dane County, throughout the state. So, I feel like I really appreciate all my colleagues. And thank you so much, Sherry, for working on this and being responsive, and also being proactive and thinking about, we needed to allow for some flexibility, but continue to be ensuring the safeness of everyone involved.
Thank you, Ananda. Stadium?
Yeah, thank you so much for your work on this, Sherry. I guess this question is directed for Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Pryor, and Ms. Terrell Webb as well. But, speaking as someone who has a disability, is Black, and is an educator, groups of people who have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, 2 questions. How does this policy change, from the back end, help communicate with people in our schools on the front end to have clear expectations, even as they change? And then 2, what are the enforcement mechanisms to ensure that people are in compliance with the recommended guidelines, even if they don't live in the embedded policy?
Well, I can answer that. From my perspective, I think it's what we do in terms of, if the policy is there, you still have the practice, right? So if we change this policy to have the specificity, if we go with it being 75/50, we're still going to enforce. We should be doing everything around hygiene anyway. If we haven't learned anything, we've learned a lot during COVID to even increase our ability to execute whatever it is in terms of safety at the local level. And I think this has changed all of us forever. So I think when you're talking about particularly one group of students, and I think all students have learned, staff have learned, the communities have learned from this. So to myself, it's just us continuing to do exactly what we've done and being out front and saying we're taking safety first, we're taking the science first in our district. We just continue to reinforce that. That's what I see us doing. If the policy is either way, we're going to continue to do this work every day at a very high level. Safety will be first where it matters.
Thank you. Yeah, I am interested in developing a policy that provides the most clear expectations as possible and allows us to adjust as the science and the rate of spread changes as well. And of course, there will be, school level minutia that we should allow the flexibility for schools to adjust on the fly as well, depending on their, specific scenarios. So those are things I'll be weighing, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Sadian. Are there other comments or questions from the board? I've got a couple. So first of all, I very much appreciate this discussion, and I very much appreciate the desire for our administration to be able to be nimble and respond to both whatever COVID brings our way in the next few months or year and other diseases that might emerge as they do. So I thank you for bringing that to the table, that need to be nimble. My first concern is actually about the inactivation of the 3 policies that were written in response to the emergency order. The process that was laid out for us was that for an activation of policy was that the administration would bring it to the board, discuss it with the board, and then just move forward and inactivate without a board vote. Our board policy on policies says nothing about inactivating a policy. We have nothing in our own policy about how to do this. And I feel that in the absence of having a policy about how to inactivate, we should default to a board vote. That's just my feeling. If we had a policy saying that the procedure was what was outlined in this memo, I'd be comfortable with it, but that was not voted on by the board, and policy lies in the realm of the board, not administration. So I would strongly advocate for the board to vote to inactivate these 3 policies. Otherwise, following your recommendation, but not just a presentation and then an assumption that the board's on board with doing that. So that's my first concern. My second concern is about the guidance document. I actually very much appreciate the approach of updating the communicable disease policy and then pairing it with a guidance document that can be more nimble. But I would feel more comfortable passing the changes to this policy if I could review the guidance document alongside it. I remember back when we passed our wellness policy many years ago, the administration just brought forth the wellness policy. The board and the public felt that it was too bare bones, and the administration ended up coming back with a guidance document to go with that policy, and that made everybody happy because they could read the guidance and they liked the guidance and it was all good. And it was a good way to be transparent and communicate to the public what our guidance around wellness would be. I feel that as we update the communicable disease policy, we need to do the same thing. We need to have that guidance document so that we can review it, so that it's there for the public to see and review. I think the work that the communications team has done to communicate our COVID procedures is great, but having everything in one guidance document that the public can look up and see on board docs would be really helpful. And so in the interest of communications and also laying out clear expectations, I would prefer to hold off on the changes to the communicable disease policy until we've seen that guidance document. The changes that have been proposed, I think wisely, are not specific to COVID. And therefore, because we're not changing this document to specifically respond to COVID, I think we could hold off on the vote until we've seen the guidance and then vote on both together. And then the real question that lies out there is, do we inactivate our current COVID policies now or after we pass changes to the communicable disease policy? My final comment is that I feel that the proposed changes to the communicable disease policy should have gone through our board policy committee. Because they're not urgent, they're not mandated by Public Health Madison Dade County, and they're not specific to COVID, I think it would be better process to have the board policy committee review those changes before the board votes on them. I think it just sets a correct precedent. So those are my comments. The other thing I have is just share, I had a couple of very small wording changes, and I assume you'd prefer I just email those to you, to the communicable disease policy. So please go ahead and respond to that if you wish. And then I see Nikki and Chris's hands as well.
Sherry, did you have a
I don't-
response before?
No.
Okay. So duly noted in terms of your comments, and we definitely consider that. But I think here at the board, I'm looking to hear what all of you have to say.
Nikki and then Chris.
I have to agree. I didn't include that part originally. I am always for a board vote because the board has 4 main duties. They are to draft policy, interpret policy, make a budget, and hire and fire a superintendent. We hired a great one, and so we've done one right. Congratulations, that's wonderful. Now let's do number 2, which is to work on the creation of policy that makes sure that we have the right to vote on it. So that way we don't have to worry in the future and put anyone through stress on whether something is a practice or a policy. It just makes it much cleaner, and it adds to the transparency of government, so that way we don't get sued by the likes of Will or what other right-wing fringe group feels like suing us on a daily basis. I don't believe that's the sole reason to do it, but very simply, I think that power should lie in the board. Secondly, I think that can be done quite quickly at the meeting in August. or at latest September, at latest first week of September, because it isn't urgent, and I think that rescinding them right now would only lead to confusion. And already we have a lot of parents and a lot of kids who are pretty anxious as is. But that's my view. I respect everyone's view, and I really respect how serious we're taking this, because it's quite clear we all love our kids and we all want what's best for them.
Thank you, Nikki. Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there is a little bit of urgency to this. I would say that going forward, we either need to go with the communicable disease policy going forward, or we need to amend, for sure, at least the protective measures policy, because that was put in place in January when we were under different conditions, we were under different CDC guidelines, and there are some things as far as distancing and masking that really need to be changed before the beginning of the school year. And so whichever route we decide to take, going with the more general communicable disease policy, or editing and changing, making the changes that are needed specifically to the protective measures policy, we really need to do one of those before the end of the month. I think it's pretty important.
Any other comments at this point? So several things are out there right now. One thing is just to move forward with the vote on the communicable disease policy at the end of August. The proposed changes that have been brought before us without a guidance document. One possibility is to wait on that vote until we have a guidance document. One possibility out there is just to rescind our three Public Health Madison Dane County policies without a board vote. One possibility is that the board will vote on rescinding those policies. And if we don't rescind policy 7551 in particular, it would need to be updated to reflect the actual requirements that we're implementing fall semester, because that policy calls for people to be masked indoors and outdoors and 6 feet of distancing in classrooms, which doesn't reflect our practice at this point. So that's a lot of possibilities. And I think we need to come to some kind of, we aren't voting today, but come to some kind of an agreement about how to move forward. And I would welcome comments from the board about what you would like to do. I see Nikki and then Chris.
Point of order, if I may. Chris, I know you are chairing the meeting. Ali, I know you are president. I can request, from what I know in Robert's rules, and I am not perfect, is it possible that a decision can be made on whether or not the board has the right to vote on it at this meeting? Or would that need to go through something else? I'm asking for clarification.
Chris, do you
I'm
want to
sorry,
address that?
Nikki, I'm not sure what, vote on what?
On whether we have the right to vote.
So Nikki, I don't think the question is whether or not we have the right to vote. I think the question is whether or not the action taken requires the board to vote. In terms of, we absolutely have to vote for the new policy, and whether or not the board votes to eliminate the previous policies is kind of part of the conversation. So both votes would take place at our regular meeting. I'm comfortable with the board voting on the variety of actions we spoke to this evening, meaning both voting, of course, the board has to vote to enact new policy, but also to shift policy. And then it's a question of whether or not we're voting to change the policy versus whether or not we're voting to eliminate the policy and use the other policy as a catch-all. And I think that's a little bit of what I would need clarification around in terms of what we're going to do at the end of the month.
Thank you, that was well
I
put.
appreciate that.
Chris?
Yeah, I was hoping Sherry might be able to help us out here with the health services guidance document, like timeline for that, and if that is something that would be able to be brought back to us before the August 30th meeting, so that we can look at that side by side with the communicable diseases policy, like Chris suggested, or if we need more time to do that, and if we really need to focus on shifting that protective measures policy in the short term.
As I indicated earlier, in an email to you, that particular guidance document, the health services guidance document, rests with the health services department. So I'd have to get that from Nurse Smith. With regard to the protective measures, I would posit that not only would that one need to be changed, but also the facilities cleaning policy, because neither one of those address what we're currently doing. And so that is why I proposed 75/50, so that we're not doing piecemeal policy changes. And we already have a policy that could very well cover all three at one time.
Right, no, I appreciate that, and you did indicate that earlier. I think it's important for the rest of the board to know that, that where that health services guidance document lives, and I think we're gonna need that one way or another before the school year starts, if that's what we're basing our guidance for schools off of. So it seems to me that we might be able to work on that, and be able to get that before the end of the month for a board vote.
Sure, that's fine. And I will note that that guidance document is not the document that Dr. Jenkins based his reopening guidance with regard to COVID safety plans on. That, as I said, the health guidance document is the document that covers the state mandated bloodborne pathogen requirements that all staff and students have to be trained on. It contains other generalities, but however, the prime focus of that document is bloodborne pathogens. And so I don't want to, in any way indicate that Dr. Jenkins relied on a document that he may or may not have seen. He actually relied on our health experts and the metrics team to come to the decision that is currently placed on our website, which is the district's COVID safety plan.
I appreciate that, Sherry. So that helps to clarify that there's probably not a whole lot of COVID guidance right now, currently in that health services document, and it would probably need some work in order, if we were going to use it in that capacity.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Sabian, and then Dr. Jenkins.
Yeah, thank you. I think as it relates to this, when we have sprawling policies or piecemeal policies, I think it would behoove us to work smarter and not create unnecessary work for staff and ourselves. So I don't mind voting on this at the end of the month. I think we need to make a cohesive single policy that our strategy to mitigation efforts can fall under, that will allow us to adjust and follow the science as the conditions change. And yeah, I think that's my thought.
Dr. Jenkins?
Actually, our counselor came back to it in terms of how I made the decision. It wasn't based upon that. So thank you so much, Sherry, for saying that. And I just want to say to all of you, we want to get it out as soon as possible. Thus far, we've been leading with our communication on this, and we want to continue to do that so that everyone can know what to expect when they come back to school. The outdoor masking piece, we all know that needs to change. Like, the people need to know that we're not doing that.
So I think at the end of the day, we have 3 weeks until the August regular meeting. It's on August 30th or 31st. So we have a little time before this vote, which I think would give us time to, even if there's a draft guidance document, I would just, even if the guidance document is not specific to COVID, I would feel more comfortable voting on a policy that is linked to a guidance document with at least a draft of that guidance document in hand, just so that we know that that document exists. I think the policy actually refers to developing guidelines. I think we actually need to say, referring to guidelines instead, a policy shouldn't say we'll make guidelines later. It should be used in tandem with the guidelines, I think. So that would be helpful. And I would still very strongly advocate for the board to vote to enact the 3 other policies in conjunction with action on policy, the communicable disease policy 75/50. Also, because we have 3 weeks, Chris and Sabian, if you, as board policy committee, wanted to do some work together on this policy, I think there's time there for you guys to look at it together and see if you have any concerns or questions. So, any other comments? Nikki?
Just want to thank everyone again for their work. This is a great and great discussion, a very serious subject. Yes, I do believe the board needs to vote on on the policies, all of them, and whether the board should rescind it. And I think that is very important. But I don't think we should be doing the rescinding in the middle of COVID. But I thank everyone again. You guys are great. Thanks.
Anything else? Maya, you haven't had a chance to speak. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Thanks, Sherry, for the update. And I mean, I have the same sentiments as Savion mentioned of just making sure that we are streamlining our policies, but also our practices. And I'm good for voting on both pieces, like the piece of rescinding some policies and also voting on new policy. My thoughts are very similar to what Sherry had mentioned already, is that as we're moving through COVID right now, things are constantly changing, and who knows like how things may manifest next year. So having some kind of policy that is able to, I can't think of a word like catch all, but not necessarily catch all, is going to be super beneficial for us to be able to navigate the way that we need to in the future. So those are kind of my thoughts.
Thank you, Maya. All right, well, Sherry, thank you so much for bringing this to the board, and thank you to everyone for a robust and good discussion. And Ollie, I know you'll be involved in decisions on how we move forward with the agenda for the August regular board meeting. So.
Absolutely, thank you.
That concludes our agenda for tonight's meeting. I know we have another special meeting after this one, so I will not take any extra time. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn. Yeah, second.
All right, moved by Ollie, seconded by Ananda. All those in favor, say aye or raise your hand. All right, motion carried 7-0. And thank you everyone for a great meeting. Much appreciated. Ollie, do you want to take a little break before we dive into the next meeting, or just move forward?
Yeah, so we can take 5 minutes. Let's come back at 7:35.
Real quick question, are we staying on this Zoom or moving to a new Zoom room?
New Zoom.